All right. And I have to say, as a bookseller, I see a lot of book trailers, a lot of book introductory videos, and that has to be one of the best I've seen maybe ever. So with that, I don't think I can do anything but turn it over. Shirley and Higuchi, Kathleen, Doug, all three of you, welcome.
Thank you, Chris. And I really appreciate Boswell Books inviting the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation and the JCL of Wisconsin for sponsoring this event. This is a fabulous opportunity to connect with some of our community in Wisconsin, which includes Kathy and Doug. But I want to give a little bit of background on the book for those of you who may not know much about the Japanese American incarceration. Unfortunately, during World War II, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans and Japanese citizens were rounded up on the West Coast and put into 10 concentration camps scattered throughout the Rockies and in very desolate areas. And one of those camps is called the Heart Mountain Relocation Center, where my parents' children had met. And this story is really kind of a 360 discussion of the incarceration, beginning when my parents were born here in the United States, but before that, when my grandparents came in the early 1900s. And those family members are the Higuchi side of the family, which is my father's side. And then my mother's side, the Saito, where Kathleen comes in as a younger sister who was born at the camp. So that's sort of the backdrop of the incarceration. The reason why we're focusing on secrets tonight is that all three of us had certain revelations throughout our lives about the incarceration, and we're going to dive into the secrets that we talked about in this book. But it really all started back for me in terms of the explosion of information in 2005. On my mother's deathbed. She was dying of pancreatic cancer. And as many of you know, with cancer, especially pancreatic, it's incredibly aggressive. And it was very difficult, I think, for us to manage that period of time. So my Aunt Kathleen, who was on the screen with us, was there when it happened. But on her deathbed, she said she wanted her coden or her memorial money to go to Heart Mountain. And the beginning of the story is I was totally stunned, as well as my family members, because my mother really never talked about Heart Mountain. And I think in some ways, she might have brought Kathy a little bit more in terms of her secret journey of sending money to Heart Mountain to dream of something being built there. But she had actually been sending money. It was all anonymous. I didn't know anything about it. And she was attending meetings that she never talked to me about with her other board members, dreaming of something to occur at Heart Mountain. So that's sort of the backdrop and the genesis. But the other piece of this book that I just want to mention before we dive into this discussion with Kathy and Doug is what I did is focus on maybe about 10 or so central characters in their family. And it's sort of a full circle. It starts in the beginning when, Normanetta and Al Simpson's parents were alive, as well as my family. And so it starts in the early 1900s and it sort of builds into a complete arc of their experiences before camp, in camp, and then after camp. And the final conclusion of this book is actually me going to Japan, being funded by the foreign ministry to meet up with some relatives in Japan that still live there that don't speak English. And ironically, they actually knew about Heart Mountain as well. And that was a big surprise and a secret. And these relatives couldn't speak Japanese, so I had an interpreter. So that's sort of the beginning and the end of the story. But I guess I want to, punt this first question to Kathy so I can get some insights from her, if she can unmute. And Doug, you may want to also unmute as well, because, I would like you to chime in after Kathy. But Kathy, can you talk about what it was like when my mother was dying in Salt Lake City? And I know you were here with me taking care of her. And the idea of really going in and asking her, where do you want your memorial money to go? And how did that all unravel?
Well, Sets, had gone through a series of treatments at Johns Hopkins and received excellent care. And I think we all were appreciative. And I think in my mind, I thought perhaps that might be a place that she might want to have people donate if they wish to. But it all started when I had a conversation with your father about, since Sets was getting close to the end, that it was time to consider an obituary and what to put in there. And I realized then there were some very basic things I didn't know. But in that process of talking to her, the last thing, of course, is, for the koden or the donation to a cause or organization. When she said Heart Mountain, that even threw me off. As much as I knew her involvement up until then. I think all of us, because of your father's background and being involved with the universities like the University of Michigan and Utah, I think that's where we thought the money might possibly go, in addition to Johns Hopkins. But anyway, so when she said Heart Mountain, and I share that with all of you and the family, I think we were quite surprised.
Right. And Doug, I want to kind of jump into your background and your discoveries and how that all came about. You were a young graduate student attending the University of Wyoming, and you sort of stumbled upon this. And I know you wrote a book about this history. How did that all occur for you?
Well, for a variety of complicated reasons, my wife and I, days or weeks after we got married in 1968, which is a million years ago, got in a car and headed to Laramie, Wyoming, to the University of Wyoming, where I was headed because they, out of undergraduate school, offered me a job teaching history to freshmen at the University of Wyoming, which I will confess to all of those people who may or may not know the context. Teaching school in 1968 was a draft deferrable activity. And I wanted to delay as long as I could getting involved in a war that I didn't support. So that's how we ended up in this peculiar place. In the back of my mind, I had an awareness that there were 10 relocation centers. I had an awareness then, and I wasn't prescient or extremely sensitive, but I knew this was, this whole episode was illegal, and I knew that it was an awful experience. I couldn't have given you more details about it than that. But I also had another assumption, and that was because it was a big illegal and among the top 5 most egregious departures from American traditions of civil rights and upholding constitutional guarantees. I thought everybody in 1968 had written about this, and I was, so when I came there and knew that there was a camp up near Yellowstone Park, Heart Mountain, I sort of toyed with the idea. I asked a professor who subsequently became a major figure in Asian American history, Roger Daniels. I said, Roger, I would like actually to write something about this Heart Mountain place, but I'm sure it's all been done. And he said, to the best of my knowledge, 1 paragraph has been written about Heart Mountain, except for some episodic memoirs. And so that was surprise number 1, that it hadn't been touched. And speaking of a secret, this is much like you described in the book, for many people, including yourself, the experience of your parents and grandparents was a secret. 25 years after the war ended, awareness of what happened at Heart Mountain and 10 other places for 3 years during World War II was so unknown, unrecognized, unfamiliar as itself to be a secret. And it's a secret in two ways. It was a secret that did not make the mainstream of American history at that time. And I was stunned as I got to know Japanese American Nisei, who had lived in the camp, that their children knew almost nothing about what had happened to them. I think, as in the case of your mother, this was a very useful secret. I think it was a way to protect their children from the anxiety and vulnerability and horror of what had happened to them. And it was, I think, a cultural strategy for a long time to try to cope with it by burying it. So when I tried to get interviews with people, the sons and daughters of people who had lived at the camp to try to dig up information, and I was surprised that they knew less than I did. So there's a whole story there that I think your book dramatizes in the most moving way. So I think my surprise at the beginning was really how such an important traumatic thing, both on a historical scale and on a personal level, had been largely buried.
Right.
Well, you know, Doug, you brought up an interesting point in that my parents, even though I was born in camp, I was about 2 when we left camp. And all those years, they really didn't talk about it. And when I was asked to join the board, I remember I was asked, why didn't they talk about it? I mean, but you know, when they said that, I thought, I wonder why. And I think it was partly, of course, to protect the children. That's important. But also that there was some shame attached. You know, culturally, the Japanese are very proud, and there are strict rules. You know, you don't show your emotion, you know, unnecessarily, which I find hard to do, but it was amazing that in spite of all the things that I learned after I joined the board, much like Shirley and my journey learning about it from other incarcerees older than I, what they went through, and yet they really didn't talk about it, nor were they bitter about it, if you can imagine. Because I remember saying, you know, at some point, you know, wasn't it awful? And, you know, are you angry? I don't know if I use that word angry, but then you know, that's part of the philosophy. That's the culture of the Japanese. You know, when they came from Japan, they carry that with them.
Well, a lot of, you know, the cultures from Japan did carry over. And I think that is sort of how one of the secrets that I learned more about was how the resistors, which was one of the famous group of young men who turned 18 in the camp. And many of them, like Dr. Takashi Hoshizaki, refused to go fight in a war where the very government that he would be fighting for was incarcerating himself and his family. So I learned that was sort of a secret that I learned more about, because the Japanese Americans really prided themselves in terms of being brave, you know, and patriotic, and a lot of emphasis was put on the brave men who did actually go fight the 442, one of the most decorated units in our history. So it is kind of interesting when you dive into that. So, you know, Kathy, the beautiful video that we just experienced was produced by my cousin, your daughter, Vanessa. And I really love the work that she's done in terms of investigating her family history and the films she made, you know, interviewing you. So I guess in terms of your own discovery of this, what kind of discoveries did your daughter have in terms of finding more about your history that she knew nothing about?
Well, what's interesting is that I didn't really have that interest in delving, like kids do now about family history. It was when Vanessa, my daughter, was in 5th grade, and she had a project which was to find out more about the family, and she made a family tree and all of that. And then the questions came, which I didn't quite know the answers to. My brother, my older brother, was one who was a teenager, and I think he was about 13 or so. And I think if you were to say who was affected, I think he was the most affected. That's Al, and that's in the book. But as far as I was concerned, being the youngest, didn't bother to ask. They didn't talk about it, so why ask? Vanessa, on the other hand, kept on digging, probing me. And I know that my brother Al had asked, me and her many times to go with him. And I think Al might have been also the one that motivated Setsuko to get involved. But through the years, I think Vanessa learned more on her own. And with that one project, it led to other things. And to fast forward to, after she graduated from college, she went on to film school and had a project and made it on Heart Mountain. And it's called An American Contradiction, which I think was beautifully done because it's from the perspective of someone her age. I'm a young Nisei. My daughter is Sansei, but most of her friends are Yonsei, so, but to have that perspective was interesting because for her, it was a complete, she didn't even know where I was born until she started this project. And since then, she's been quite involved, that Shirley, with Heart Mountain. And she too has realized how important the lessons are from Heart Mountain.
Yeah, and what I kind of find sort of interesting, and I wish somebody could help solve this problem, but I know that other Sansei daughters like me and other sons sometimes have trouble getting their cousins and their other family members engaged in this. So I kind of wonder, like, why was Uncle Al Saito, who's a major character in my book, and thank God he kept really good notes, and Vanessa interviewed him a lot, because I really didn't have much to go on. I mean, if you think about the fact that nobody really talked about it, there wasn't a lot of documentation. What I had to rely on were the war relocation files, which were really quite interesting when I actually dug into those. But thank God for Uncle Al keeping the notes and talking about it and letting Vanessa interview him and document it. I got a lot of the information from him, and thank God on the Higuchi side, my dad's older brother, Uncle James, actually kept a diary and really accounted some of his experiences, and actually forced his siblings like my father and my aunt and others to talk about and document their history. But I thought for James, for instance, and I think Uncle Al was a lot like this on the Saito side, which I appreciate, is the ability to be very honest about that experience and actually tell the truth in terms of what their own experiences really were. Whereas, for instance, my dad didn't talk much about it, but in some ways, and my book documents this, my mom kind of sugarcoated it. In other words, didn't make it sound as bad as it was. And I'm sure that was a self-protective mechanism for her, but it was also her efforts, I think, to sort of protect me as well. So I guess my question is this, and Doug, I don't know if you actually, when you were able to talk to certain Nisei that seemed to be more present and more able to talk, why is it that somebody like Uncle Al or James had that chip, the chip that gives you the strength to talk, And then why is it, do you think, that we have a bunch of other Nisei and Sansei that just really don't want to have anything to do with this?
Well, there may be lots of reasons for that. I do think that for many decades, for lots of Japanese American families like yours, there was an avoidance. I think the awakening and the almost remarkable growth and change in the way the Japanese American community understands the centrality of the incarceration experience, came really from two sources, and Vanessa is a good example. One of the sources were the Sansei and Yansei kids who grew up in a culture that encouraged aspirations and expression, and on the progressive side, encouraged a critique of the inequality and unfairness in American society. Those kids, I think, and I often heard them say, "What's wrong with my parents? Why didn't they talk about this? Why aren't they angry about this? Why didn't they do something about that?" All of which have very complicated, good answers, but in some ways that made the subject unavoidable for lots of people. And I think that interest in understanding what happened to their grandparents and their parents, and the comfort or need that they had to, in fact, know about it and feel like they should do something constructive as a result of that suffering that occurred in their family. I also think that the beginning of the scholarship had a impact on some people. One of the great men in the history of Heart Mountain is a guy named Bacon Sakatani, who was an archetypal Nisei guy, I understand from the way he tells the story. And in his 60s, young middle age, he didn't know about this, except he remembered that it wasn't a bad place to spend adolescence, or he couldn't identify any trauma in that. And he said that when he read my book, which was an early effort to try to understand Heart Mountain at all, it pissed him off. He was outraged all of a sudden. If my book did any good in this world, one of the most important goods it did was to inspire Bacon Sakatani, who has led a whole movement of consciousness raising and movement development, and really has made it necessary for people to understand what happened to him and everybody else at Heart Mountain. So I think those broke open that silence, the generational stuff. And then as people learned about it, and learned about it from outsiders who thought it was an awful thing, yeah, I gave people permission, I think, by saying it was an awful thing, to say it was an awful thing without shame.
Well, Doug, speaking of Bacon, I recall one of my first meetings at Heart Mountain, that he asked me certain questions and I didn't know the answer. And then he looked at me and said, "You don't know much about Heart Mountain, do you?" And you know what he did? He copied your book, printed, copied the book and sent it to me so I could read it. Now, isn't that dedication? I mean, can you imagine the work of taking every page and making a copy of it? And so your book is going to be republished, isn't that correct?
That's yeah. I think next spring the foundation is going to republish it, and it's coming full circle for me. It's 50 years ago to think that it can, and of course this book, when we put out this edition, still is a good primer. It's a good entry point into the history of Heart Mountain. I think it's lasted well enough in that regard, and we're going to make it. The proceeds of it help us continue to build programs and structures at the at the site, at the museum. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. And maybe Boswell Books will let us, the three of us, come on next year and talk about that updated version of the history of the concentration camp at Heart Mountain.
Well, the three of us actually have known each other. Well, obviously I've known Kathy for a very long time because she's my aunt. But we've actually, really been through a lot, the three of us together, and a lot of trials and tribulations, which I really don't think that a lot of people appreciate. The politics and the delicate nature that's involved in terms of building a museum that sort of replicates the barracks and the camp atmosphere at the very site where, well over 10,000 individuals were incarcerated without due process. So I would like to sort of open this up and shift it a little bit, because actually the whole process of my involvement with Heart Mountain has been a total surprise. I mean, not only the secrets that are unveiled in my book, but also, I guess, the strength of the relationships that our leadership and our board members have in really being determined to really, get something built there, which really far exceeded the dreams of my mother, because that was one of her dreams, was to have something built there, which was, of course, another secret. As a matter of fact, one of the original titles of the book was going to be My Mother's Dream. But then the people were interested, publishers were interested in Setsuko's Secret. So I guess, Doug, when you look back at, and Kathy, I'm going to ask you the next question, what would you say was really the biggest challenge of building something at Heart Mountain? And what was I guess the biggest challenge, and what made it really difficult in your mind?
Well,
go ahead.
Well, I was going to just say that location, to build a museum that you wanted people to go to, as for instance, a pilgrimage. Doug, go ahead.
I was going to say there are a lot of challenges in doing this, but I think what Shirley is raising about the challenges. My quick story is that when Linda and I got ready to leave Wyoming in 1970, and we had spent a year immersed in the photographs and the lives of people who had lived at Heart Mountain for those 3 years, I had WRA had thousands of photographs, so I had a visual idea of what happened at Heart Mountain that was strong and concrete. And on our last trip up there before leaving Wyoming and coming to Wisconsin, we went up there, and in 1970 there was nothing but a chimney there. Nothing, not a marker, not a story, there was a few old buildings up near the chimney, not a barrack in sight, no barbed wire, no towers, everything was gone. And I remembered saying to Linda before we got back in the car, I said, someday somebody or some people, some important people are going to do something here so people know what happened here. And I thought that was going to be my last contribution, that worry. 20 years later, or 25 years later, some Wyoming people who had decided that they ought to preserve that site to some degree or put up a sign, got a hold of me and said, would you help us do something here? And I had lived another life, and I myself was not important, but I was the president of a big foundation, so I knew lots of important people. So I realized I could help turn the aspirations of Sets and lots of other people, help turn that into a reality. But the process of doing this was really hard. This is what I think Shirley is thinking about. When I came on the board, the foundation was led by well-intended, hardworking Wyoming people. But they were folks who wanted to tell the story of Heart Mountain in a way that would give offense to nobody. certainly that would not give offense to people in Wyoming where they knew they had to live and where this thing had to grow. I was from the beginning convinced that this museum wouldn't be worth building unless it was a way to have the story told in the voice of the Japanese Americans who lived there. And I was committed to the idea that this board of the foundation ought to slowly or quickly become a board really made up of Japanese Americans who had firsthand connections to the story and who could tell the story. And I believe we built a museum out of that perspective that's really an extraordinary place that everybody on this webinar ought to go someday. But that led to a lot of tension. The idea of, you know, the Wyoming folks were trying to do the Japanese Americans a favor, and the Japanese Americans who were getting involved in this were eager to tell the story as they understood it. And that was a source of conflict that luckily we survived. It is now the only major historical site relating to the incarceration, which is held in a nonprofit, a private nonprofit hands, not a government agency. And 80% of our board are Japanese Americans who have a connection to it. And at the risk of talking too long, but I want to get back to Shirley, I have a secret to reveal. In 2005, when I was a fairly new member of the board and was beginning to get worried about whether we were going to find a way to involve Japanese Americans in an important way to empower them to really decide what this thing should be. I went to the opening of Set's historic trail. I was part of that group. And that was the first time I laid eyes on Shirley and her son, Bill. They came, were invited because they were going to name this thing after Shirley's mom. They needed a member of the family there. And I got to know Shirley in an hour and a half, and two things occurred to me. And this is the first time I've admitted this to Shirley. One is she knew nothing about what this was. You could tell quickly she didn't have a clue what this was. But she was emotionally so overwhelmed by the place, I think, by the people, by their perception of their mother, by what that honor roll stood. This was my perspective. And I said to myself, any DC lawyer who's this closely connected to this place and is capable of such emotional depth in just her introduction to it. I said, someday she's going to help run this place. And and that is why, because she and you and a whole host of people on this board have decided to make this a tribute to the resilience and to the suffering of the Japanese Americans who were there. That's why this is a special place. And that whole story is captured so amazingly in Shirley's book.
And I do talk about, you know, after my mother died, and it was very stressful. And I really felt that as a family, we were very debilitated by that process. It was a very long death. And, you know, when I got that call from Pat Wolf about coming out again, you know, like any good Japanese American who is a little bit of a Japanese American dummy about the incarceration, my first impulse was, I don't want to go. And then, of course, my dad didn't want to go. And then my two brothers didn't want to go. So I'm just sitting there. I remember in this home, I'm in Salt Lake City right now, this large home. I was, you know, with my dad, and I was thinking, you know, am I doing something wrong here by not going to a dedication where my mother is being honored? And it's almost like I couldn't really like wrap my head around it. My first impulse, you know, the defensiveness that I think occurs when you're a Sansei Japanese American incarceration legacy, is to be suspicious, right? what do they want? You know, oh my God, I wonder if they want money. I wonder if they want this. And then my immediate reaction was I got really angry. Like, why in God's name are, you know, is the Wyoming, you know, people at Heart Mountain trying to get me to come out there right after my mom dies? Like, who does that? You know, so I, for whatever reason it was, I decided to go. And I remember telling my son, Bill, like, I really don't want to go. And he goes, Mom, I'll go with you. You know, which when you have that one little bit of support from a family member, it makes a world of difference, you know. So we actually flew to, you know, Cody, rented a car and drove out to the site. But I think the overwhelming nature of the amount of people and the energy level and the Nisei, and then people like Doug, who obviously isn't Japanese American, but obviously committed, and see Norm Mineta and Al Simpson and Pete, and, you know, Bill Hosokawa, who was a former prisoner that became, who was head of the newspaper in the camp as a prisoner, but he actually ended up being an editor at the Denver Post. It was like, wow, this is an overwhelming experience. This is bigger than a bread box. And it really, the emotion that I exhibited there really had to do with losing my mother, you know, and realizing that at that point, like, how stupid was I that I didn't understand that when my mother said I wanted my Koden to go to Heart Mountain, this place had really great meaning. And I think, you know, if somebody doesn't talk about something doesn't mean they don't really care about it. And I think that's the real tragedy of a lot of the Japanese American incarcerees and their families, is that, you know, what's going to happen is that grandchild or the niece is going to one day wonder, why didn't they ask grandma, or why didn't they ask grandma or grandpa about this, or my uncle? And the biggest experience that I get with my peers and the younger generation is the regret that they never had a chance to talk to their grandmother or their parents about this, which is really what my regret is today. You know, my regret is that my mother isn't here to see what we've accomplished. My regret is that I didn't spend more time talking to Uncle James or Uncle Al. My regret is that I didn't spend more time with my grandmother, who didn't speak much English, but she knew a lot and she was very wise. And the end of my book, if folks read it, is me meeting in Japan her niece, who's now like 89 years old. She's in an assisted living center in Saga Prefecture. She told me that my grandmother, Chie, actually visited her after the war and spent like 6 months there. And they stayed up night after night after night crying. And my grandmother told her everything about her incarceration experience. So the conclusion of my book is I shouldn't have to travel to Saga, Japan with an interpreter to learn what I should have known, you know, some, you know, 50 years earlier, which is the incarceration fractured a lot of families. The government taught us not to talk about it. And, you know, essentially, in many ways, the government's plan worked. Their goal was to make sure Japanese Americans were assimilated, that they didn't have any kind of clannishness or cliquishness, and they essentially became that model minority, which I think is a lot of unnecessary pressure, because there is no model minority. It's just that, you know, the whole history of the incarceration and the trauma that's been placed on other communities has really gotten us to a space where we're sort of, you know, kind of pitting against each other, when in reality, none of this is our fault. But I wanted to shift things very quickly before questions start coming in. All three of us and many of our leaders at Heart Mountain are working on the Mineta Simpson Institute project, which is a way for us to, you know, to honor two main characters in my book, Secretary Norman Mineta, as well as Senator Al Simpson. Doug, can you give us a little bit of background? I know you're chairing that effort, and Kathy, you're actually on the fundraising committee, about why it's important to have this Mineta Simpson Institute.
Well, I should say, by way of introduction to why it's so important, and it's probably obvious to everybody that's listening, and I hope one of the reasons people would read your book to begin with, and that is the lesson of Heart Mountain boiled down to its core is it was a massive crime driven by racism. And the stereotyping mixed with fear and justified by racial prejudice not only uprooted 120,000 innocent people and put them in concentration camps, but is the same toxic mixture that we have right around the corner in this country right now. And the lessons of a lack of vigilance or a lack of resistance to this kind of way of expressing fear makes this the most as timely a story as anybody caring about the future of this country can read right now. And really that's the Minetta Simpson Institute is to take, we have a wonderful museum in a wonderful historic site that everybody should visit and learn about this story. But not everybody is going to visit. We're going to have to find ways of telling this story that by training teachers, by developing multimedia ways of reaching younger generation, by publishing books that can expand the folks who benefit from the story of Heart Mountain way beyond any number that will ever have the opportunity to come and experience the place itself. And the Minetta Simpson Institute is an effort to get the Heart Mountain Foundation in a position where it can become a source of that information, this experience, can engage people across the country and can help translate what happened there. What happened there can happen again. And that when people know that and recognize the elements that led to it, maybe we're a little bit better off to make the future of this country not replicate that particular horror. So the Minetta Simpson Institute, and there are two guys, Republican and Democrat, very different guys, who all their lives shared a common recognition of the horror of the incarceration and the importance of tolerance and the importance of civil liberties in this country. And we want to honor their commitment to that and use the Institute to project that story to audiences all across the country and now and to Japan.
Yes, and Kevin Miyazaki just added to the chat that what's really crazy about this relationship is they actually met as Boy Scouts inside the camp. Norm was a cute little Boy Scout in Heart Mountain, and Al Simpson belonged to a troop in Cody, and they actually came in and met each other's children, and now they're lifelong friends and work together today to help Heart Mountain continue on our journey. Kathy, do you have any observations with respect to the Minetta Simpson Center? And I think that then Chris is going to join us for some questions.
And other than the fact that the remoteness at one time might have been an issue, but we've had a lot of visitors, and the impact it's had on those visitors is really amazing. I mean, some people will drive away crying. I had a friend who joined me at one of the pilgrimages, and we were talking, and all of a sudden she burst out crying. And it was because of the stories she had heard.
Yeah, it's had
So
that.
the power of place is very, very strong. And with any connection, even without the connection, you know, if you're an American and you've lived here and you've never heard this story, once you're there and you see the mountain and the place and the story that's presented at the museum, which, by the way, as Doug said, it's in the first person, which is rather unique. It's because it is from the perspective of the internees. And I do have to mention Eric Muller's name because he was the one who led the programming committee, of which I was a part of, and others, many others as well. But the wording is very well done. And it's not like, it's from the perspective of the internees and not the government.
Yeah, we're all biased, but it is a world-class museum in that funny little place. And Eric Muller and others have a lot to do with that, having been created in such a brilliant way.
Yes. So Chris, I didn't know if you were going to join us and if there are any questions that are in the queue. I'm not quite sure how much time we have left. If you can give us a time check.
Oh, for sure. Hi everyone, again. Yeah, we've got some time for questions for sure. I'm going to tell you a couple things first. In fact, someone sent me a question here for you folks. First, thanks to Julie. If you haven't been following along, there's a bunch of wonderful links to the Heart Mountain Foundation, some documentaries, video, extra photos, and just a lot of complimentary materials to go along with about the people, the stories we've been hearing about tonight. So if you scroll through the chat, folks, that's absolutely wonderful. And I wouldn't be a bookseller if I didn't mention, and I'm going to drop it in the chat one more time here, that you can also find the link to purchase Setsuko's Secret from Boswell Book Company. We are doing it for 20% off, and we do have autographed book plates. Shirley Ann was kind enough to sign and send to us, so we do have that. I'm going to drop that link in the chat here in just a second, so keep your eyes out for that. But folks, if you do have questions for Shirley and Higuchi, Kathy or Doug, or maybe all of them, feel free to type those and drop those in the chat. And the first question, we do have one from P. Harami. I have a question for the board members. How is it that Manazar is under the management of the National Park Service, yet Heart Mountain is privately sponsored, or the private nonprofit as you described?
Well, I mean, Doug, you might have more history on that, but to be sort of private and independent was a choice that as board members, we really had to make. Again, being a little bit of a Japanese American dummy on that, I really didn't know the significance of not going towards a government-owned museum until we were at the crossroads. And I think Doug felt this way as well, the importance of having the independence. Because if you think about it, you know, I think Manzanar is a fabulous museum. I've been there a couple of times, but the whole concept of having the government run a museum at the site where they incarcerated Japanese, that in a camp that was run by the government, there is a little bit of I don't know, an irony there. But Doug, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this was a hard decision to make because the National Park Service, which not only runs Manzanar, but has a relationship to a number of other sites that are under their management. The Heart Mountain family, the board, even though tempted to have our life made easy by converting Heart Mountain to a NPS site and then letting the federal government be concerned about it. And I feel to this day very strongly about this. The idea of building a historic site run by the federal government, when the last time the federal government was running the historical site, they were running it as a concentration camp, seemed like something that we should fight hard to avoid, and to assure that the diverse points of view about this experience that are held by the Japanese American community ought to be freely available and expressed and independently protected there. And now that I think of it, the National Park Service in this very year is prohibited from talking about climate change. So the idea that we would always be free from any whitewashing of this horrible experience, I think may be too optimistic. And I am really proud that Heart Mountain remains a completely nonprofit and now a pretty stable one, able to create its own resources.
Yeah, we didn't really want to have to whitewash anything or sanitize any messaging in the museum itself. I mean, I think once you have to go through that government hurdle, it always makes it a little bit more complicated. But it also allows us, you know, as a foundation and a board to really think independently as well, which is very important messaging that our foundation really wants to give to the public, that we are able to independently think and express ourselves in a unified way.
All right, another question here from Janice Summers. What do the current history textbooks being used in American schools teach about the Japanese American imprisonment? Janice says, I recall it was briefly covered in one history class in high school. Every American should know this part of our history in depth.
Well, again, Doug has a lot of background sort of historically, I think, on this issue, but I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and there was Zippo in my history books about the Japanese American incarceration. As far as I know, it's not mandated universally in each school district to teach this. When I hear about students that have actually learned about the Japanese American incarceration, I'm a little surprised. You know, Doug, were you able to get any background on that?
I would, the presence of this story in history textbooks and curriculum is much, much larger than it was 25, 40 years ago. I mean, there's no comparison, but it's still understated this is one of the things we talk about the Mineta-Simpson Institute. We, as a sort of initial start to it, we got a grant from NEH to do teacher training, high school teacher training and junior college teacher training, to equip them with the resources and materials to put together a curriculum and to recommend textbooks that really do justice to this episode of American history. So it's not where it should be. But it is much more likely that the average sophomore in high school will at least have some little bit of introduction to the forced removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans.
All right, and for what it's worth, my high school education in West Virginia did cover it a decent amount, but I think that might have been my hippie teacher who just wanted to rail against anything the government did. That was terrible. Another question here. Camille Christensen asks or says, I'm about halfway through the book, so if it's already discussed there, my apologies, although it hasn't been discussed here, so why not? She asks, what compensation was included for the Japanese American soldiers from the GI Bill after the war? I'm asking because the many stories of soldiers having to discontinue their education.
Well, the Japanese, through reparations, that was led by some of the characters in my book, one being Secretary Norm Mineta, surviving individuals who were alive at the time did receive reparation. It was a kind of a token 10,000 per inmate who's living. But in terms of the GI Bill and getting removed from school, I mean, that's a little bit of a separate issue. I don't know, Doug or Kathy, if you know anything about that.
I think a lot of World War II, Japanese American World War II veterans from the MIS and from the 442nd did go to school because their own college education was often interrupted and they were drafted out of the camps. The GI Bill was a very important resource, and it's reflected in the very high degree of college completion by young adults that lived through the camps, and many of those were able to go to school in part because of the GI Bill. So this is one minority group that benefited a lot from veterans benefits. So that's, I think they really did.
Okay, I've got one more here, and then I think if anyone has an additional one they're typing in now, after that we've got time for, maybe one or two more. And Julie started to answer this, but I'll ask you guys as well. Have you worked with Native Americans in this area of Wyoming, realizing you share common forced removal experiences?
Yes, well, that's an excellent question. For those that know the history of Heart Mountain, the mountain itself, which is magnificent, was actually original Crow Indian sacred grounds. In other words, it was sort of a blessed place for the Native American community. Unfortunately, like every traumatized minority group, they got forced out of that area. And ironically, you know, putting the Japanese Americans, ripping the Japanese Americans symbolically from their homes on the West Coast and putting them at the very side in which Native American lives were compromised and their livelihood was compromised is pretty darn ironic. But what we've done every year is that our staff does connect with the local Native American community. We've had various events. We actually had Grant Bullfeather, or Grant Bulltail, who was one of the well-known storytellers actually at our pilgrimage previously. So that connection is extremely important, and I encourage all sites, Japanese American sites, to make an effort to connect with the Native Americans so we could actually then take those experiences even before the incarceration experience.
That's wonderful. I don't see any more questions coming in. I will say we've had several hellos from around the country. So hellos and thank yous, and what a wonderful conversation coming in the chat. So let me pass that on to all of you. Any last one? Any fast fingers out there? 3, 2, 1.
Well, we have a little bit of time. I do want to say that proceeds from the book, and I encourage everyone to buy it from Boswell Books. I know you're running a 20% special, but the proceeds are going to go directly to the Minetta Simpson Institute that we're creating and building. So you'll kill a couple of birds with one stone. You'll learn more about the Japanese American incarceration, but you will also be contributing towards a really noble cause, which is to really embody the work of two great men on different sides of the aisle that have been able to come together out of wartime tragedy and have a solid relationship that really allowed them to be very productive supporters of important legislation in our nation's history. So both Norm and Al, thank God, are still with us. They come to all of our pilgrimages, and they're very excited about the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation's work and where the future of the foundation is heading. So we really see ourselves as being a site and a museum and a center of national significance, but also international significance. Because folks that have been tracking our activity, we've garnered a lot of international exposure. And in fact, we had the ambassador of Japan, as well as his entourage and the Minister of Foreign Affairs come to our past pilgrimage, which was just a wonderful experience. So, you know, given the fact we're located near Yellowstone National Park and the towns of Cody and Powell are so welcoming, I really recommend, and actually during the COVID crisis, because you could actually drive there and not get out of your car or get out of your car. And because of the spacious landscape, there's a lot of room to move around and experience that wonderful site. So I encourage all of you to do that if you haven't yet.
Well, except for this year, we do have an annual pilgrimage, which we've kind of spoken about, and generally it's held the end of July. And we'll see about this year, but something great will be planned anyway.
All right, wonderful. Well, I think that answers Julie's "what are your hopes for the future" question pretty well. That's wonderful. Let me say from Boswell, from me, Shirley Ann, Doug, Kathy, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. This has been absolutely wonderful. And for all of you out there watching, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. Again, you can pick up your copy of Shirley and Higuchi's book from Boswell Book Company. Thank you all for tuning in. We would not have a bookstore, virtual, brick and mortar down on Downer Avenue or otherwise without you. Good night, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Bye-bye.